Are you ready for one of my spicy hot takes?
Bruh, I eat spicy hot takes for breakfast. Bring it on, brother.
Well, I guess the title kinda gives it away in advance, doesn't it?
So yeah, right off the bat, the title of the video pretty much gives away the level of intellectualism this video has to offer. The title of the video in question is Why Libertarians Are Fascists, which, putting that into plain English, is basically asking why is it that people who don't want a government-controlled economy want a government-controlled economy?
So what led me to this conclusion?
Well, that's actually pretty easy to answer. It's because your Overton window is so far to the left that, from your point of view, there's basically no difference between anyone to the right of Bernie Sanders and Adolf Hitler himself.
Why do I think that libertarians, right libertarians to be specific,
I will give this guy credit. He does at the very least acknowledge that not all libertarians are on the right, which is rather rare for people who criticize libertarianism.
are fascists?
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
That's because you don't know what fascism actually is. You're using it as an ominous sounding buzzword to disingenuously attack people who disagree with you. The word fascism was actually coined by Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. It comes from the Latin word fasces, meaning bundle. It's used to describe a political and economic policy in which the government accumulates control of the economy by taking more and more control of privately owned resources. And this is pretty much what you saw in every country that adopted the ideology of fascism. Italy under Mussolini, Germany under Hitler, Japan under Emperor Tojo. They had government controlling, if not outright owning, massive swaths of their country's industries. The left often uses the word fascism as a blanket term for anyone on the right, but it's actually a lot closer to the policies they advocate for.
And of course I'm not talking about every single person who identifies as libertarian, or even right libertarian, but I did notice some worrying trends among people who call themselves that.
Well, hold on a second. Wouldn't that make the title of this video misleading then? Because the way you initially phrased your argument made it seem as if you were trying to levy this criticism against all right-wing libertarians. If these criticisms that you're bringing up only apply to a certain subset of right libertarians, then you probably should have made that more clear from the onset. This strikes me as a sort of Mott and Bailey strategy. For those of you who don't know what a Mott and Bailey is, it's sort of like a straw man in reverse. With a straw man, you substitute your opponent's argument with one that's easier to attack, whereas in a Mott and Bailey, you substitute your own argument with one that's easier to defend. This fallacy is also known as hedging, because it's as if you're putting up a giant hedge to hide your arguments behind.
And also, libertarianism has become an integral part of the Republican Party.
Yeah, if only that were the case. Unfortunately, Republicans still largely advocate for things that libertarians are against. The drug war, the police state, bloated military budgets, restrictions on immigration, restrictions on abortion, restrictions on LGBT rights.
Which is a far-right party by any measure.
All of the biggest expansions of the federal government in U.S. history happened under Republican presidents. When Donald Trump was in office, he not only raised taxes on the middle class, but also implemented draconian gun control policies that would make most Democrat politicians blush. And a lot of supposedly Republican-controlled states went along with the COVID hysteria and called for mandates and lockdowns. Doesn't seem to me like our Republican Party is really all that far right.
So there appears to be some definite connection between the far-right and right libertarianism.
Even assuming that this is true, this doesn't prove that these two ideologies are necessarily equivalent, or that believing in one somehow necessarily entails believing in the other. Simply pointing out that there are aspects where these two ideologies might correlate isn't sufficient to prove the point you're trying to get across.
But why? I mean, theoretically, they're supposed to be on different ends of the spectrum. You know, right-wing authoritarians wanting more government control, at least in theory, and right libertarians wanting less. And so here we arrive at an absolutely crucial distinction. When I say right-wing libertarian, I don't mean people who fit the definition of right-wing libertarian. I mean people who identify as right-wing libertarian.
Nigga, what?
So, same problem as I mentioned before. If this is the thesis argument that he's going for in this video, that would make the title of the video misleading. If the target of your criticisms isn't right-wing libertarians, but rather people who identify as right-wing libertarians, then why is the video named Right-Wing Libertarians Are Fascists as opposed to those who identify as right-wing libertarians are fascists? This comes across to me as some kind of attempt for him to deceive his audience somehow. He's being really pedantic about semantics semantics, and it seems like he's obfuscating what exactly it is that he's attempting to criticize in this video. And like I said before, this comes across to me as a Mott and Bailey fallacy. He's trying to shield his arguments behind another argument that's easier to defend, so he can deflect any potential criticisms by saying, oh no, I wasn't talking about libertarians, I was talking about people who identify as libertarians.
And so, do the following names sound familiar to you? Richard Spencer, Milo Yiannopoulos, Gavin McInnes, Tim Gionnet aka Baked Alaska, Stefan Molyneux, Ben Shapiro. All of these people are far-right demagogues.
Not really. I mean, first of all, Stefan Molyneux isn't even on the right. Stefan hates border restrictions and the war on drugs. And he's also made tons of videos criticizing police officers, soldiers, and other people that the right likes to worship. I mean, Stefan is somewhat Trump sympathetic, but outside of that, I wouldn't see anything that would connect him to the far right. As for Ben Shapiro, I wouldn't really call him far right. I'd say he's more moderate right. Ben Shapiro thinks that people should be allowed to, for example, have a relationship with someone of the same gender, or go through sex transition surgery, even though those are things he personally disagrees with. A better example of someone on the far right would be like Matt Walsh or Michael Knowles. Matt Walsh said that he wants to ban sex change operations for everyone, even adults. And Michael Knowles basically said in one of his videos that he thinks the government should violate the First Amendment and restrict people's right to express their gender identities. Both of those, by the way, are things that no libertarian worth their salt would ever support ever.
All of them have either started out or are currently identifying as libertarian.
With the exception of Ben Shapiro and Stefan Molyneux, I have never heard any of those people describe themselves as libertarian. I mean, heck, both Richard Spencer and Milo Yiannopoulos have both called for a white supremacist ethno-state, which is like the opposite of libertarianism.
And so it seems to me that there is such a thing as the libertarian alt-right pipeline.
Okay, so let me see if I can follow your thought process here. Out of the hundreds of thousands of people across this country who consider themselves libertarian, you found 6 examples of people, most of whom aren't even libertarian, who are also on the far right, except 2 of them aren't even on the far right, and from this concluded that there must be some kind of libertarian to alt-right pipeline. Oh yeah, that totally makes perfect sense to me.
And why is that? Well, if you're a libertarian, allegedly, chances are you will be against programs such as affirmative action.
That's because affirmative action violates the Equal Protections Clause of the Constitution. The government isn't supposed to give preferential treatment to people based on their race or ethnicity.
State welfare.
That's because state welfare is based on coercion. That's the state pointing guns at people they consider to be well off and forcing them to give their money to those they consider less fortunate. It's a system based on extortion and theft.
Anti-discrimination legislation.
That's because anti-discrimination laws violate individual freedom of association. People have the right to decide whom they want to associate and do business with, for whatever reason they want. Unfortunately, some people might choose to use that freedom in a way that's bigoted or hateful, but since everybody owns themselves, nobody has the right to demand labor from someone else against their will.
Now, do we see a pattern here?
So in case you haven't picked up on this already, his argument here is basically, libertarians disagree with these policies that I personally like, therefore they're equivalent to the far right. And a big part of this strategy is omitting the reasons why libertarians oppose these policies. Notice how he just mentions that libertarians are against these policies and never bothers going into why? This is of course part of his strategy. He wants the audience to infer that it's because libertarians are a bunch of racists who hate the poor. The actual reason that libertarians oppose these policies is because they're initiation of force. Welfare programs force people to spend their money on things against their will, and anti-discrimination laws force people to do business with people they don't want to against their will. And the reason this is important to point out is because libertarians ideologically oppose the initiation of force, even in pursuit of goals that are arguably worthwhile. Many libertarians do sympathize with the issues that these policies are intended to address, but would rather prefer non-violent means of addressing them, such as donating to the poor or boycotting businesses that decide to discriminate. Just because we might not agree with your specific preferred solution to a problem doesn't necessarily mean that we're apathetic about the problem.
In general, it seems to me that far-righters and libertarians have an awful lot in common.
Actually, you just cherry-picked a small handful of policy areas where libertarians and the far right agree, and then ignored the vast other policy areas where we don't agree. Because what you do is filter out information that comports with what you want to believe and ignore everything else.
And that's because they both believe in this thing called personal responsibility.
By the way, this is the only correct thing he says about libertarianism in the entire video.
So there you have it. Individual responsibility means that we should solve big problems through small individual changes instead of systemic approaches.
Yeah, we can take large, complex problems and break them down into smaller, simpler problems that are more easy to manage. It's not that difficult of a concept to understand.
The system isn't broken, the individual people are.
Who do you think makes up that system, though? Adam something here appears to be talking as if social, political, and economic systems are these autonomous entities that operate completely independently of the people who make them up. These systems are operated and maintained by the people within them. If you want these systems to change, then it's going to have to start with the people within them, not the other way around.
You know, if you have 10,000 black people living in a ghetto somewhere, the systemic solution to black poverty would be targeted social programs, improving the infrastructure, enforcing laws against discrimination, and so on and so forth.
You do realize that a lot of these policies are what created those ghettos in the first place. Democrat politicians like to insist on having all this subsidized low-cost housing built in their cities, thinking they're being generous or virtuous or whatever, when in reality all that happens is the poor and riffraff all get isolated in the one part of the city, and therefore social stratification and all the problems that come with it actually increases.
Whereas what Ben Personal Responsibility Shapiro would do is he would roll up in his Bentley and tell those people to start a business or something. Which is basically just the equivalent of hand-waving the issues of those people.
Wait a second. How is it hand-waving the issues of those people away to encourage them to be more responsible and self-sufficient? Wouldn't encouraging people to be more self-sufficient be the most effective solution to poverty, even more so than encouraging government dependence? I feel like if anyone here is hand-waving away their issues, it's you, since you seem to be under the mindset that the government can magically swoop in and solve all of their problems, just like it was supposed to in Detroit, Chicago, and San Francisco. Didn't really work out, did it?
Well, like, yeah, whatever, just start a business or something.
Well, I mean, to be fair, we do want to make it as easy as possible to start a business. Right now, if you want to start a business, you have to fill out a bunch of forms, pay a bunch of fees, get a bunch of different licenses, comply with a whole lot of regulations, not to mention get a big chunk of your profit taxed. In a libertarian society, starting a business would be as simple as just saying, hey, I got this product or service, who wants to pay for it?
And that's because if you subscribe to the idea of personal responsibility, then chances are you believe that the system we have currently is fine or mostly fine. And so the problems don't lie in the institutions, they lie in the individual people.
I don't know what libertarians you've been talking to, but most of us hold the current system with much disdain. We hate the fact that the government gets a special moral exemption to do things that would be considered wrong if the rest of us did it. We hate having the incomes that we work hard to earn taken from us and spent on blowing up brown children across the world. We hate being told how we're allowed to use our own property, or what kind of voluntary arrangements we're allowed to make in a free market.
Hey, would you look at that? Sounds like these right-wing libertarians really want to conserve the current system. Wow, I wonder if there's a political movement dedicated to that exact goal.
Hey pal, you just blowing from Stupid Town?
Wow, you've either done absolutely no research on libertarianism before making this video, or you're straight up lying. We frequently not only challenge the legitimacy of many government laws and policies, most of which are considered indispensable by a majority of the public, but we also challenge the very legitimacy of government itself, which is something people have more or less taken for granted for the past 2 millennia. What part of that in any way could possibly be construed as maintaining the status quo?
So yeah, basically if we follow the idea of personal responsibility, we end up invariably with conservative social policies.
What conservative social policies? Conservative social policy is a broad category that can encompass any number of things, so you're going to need to be specific. This is especially the case considering that there are actually quite a few conservative social policies that libertarians disagree with, such as the war on drugs or restrictions on gay marriage.
Quite a coincidence, isn't it? So if the darkies get too uppity in Detroit that they're poor and they have no opportunities, well, it's their problem. They're just lazy. They don't want to work. And if some soy-chugging cucked lefty points out that, hey, by the way, there's been systemic discrimination against black people, redlining policies, ramming highways through neighborhoods, you know, the disproportionate incarceration of black people for non-violent drug crimes, breaks up families and ruins communities.
So you do realize that pretty much all of those problems you just listed off were created or at least contributed to by government. government. Systemic discrimination against black people happened largely as a result of Jim Crow laws, which mandated segregation. Redlining was largely accomplished by zoning laws. Ramming highways through neighborhoods was made possible largely by eminent domain, and the war on drugs is a policy created and enforced by government. So I don't understand why you think it is that the government that's largely been responsible for creating these problems is also the key to solving it. It would be like hiring a known serial killer to be your bodyguard.
All of these concerns can be just hand-waved, dismissed with personal responsibility. Because you can just tell them, well, liberal, you say, let's say that black people are, let's say, discriminated against, but have you heard about this thing called personal responsibility? Yep, they can just move, or they can just create a business.
Well, if I had things my way, there would be no zoning laws keeping blacks stuck in shitty neighborhoods, no property taxes keeping them stuck in shitty schools, no building codes making better quality housing less affordable, no regulations making it more difficult to start a business or get a better job. The left likes to go on about all the barriers that keep poor people and minorities from improving their lives, but they never seem to want to talk about where those barriers come from.
They can just, let's say, stop being poor if they want to, but they don't. What does this mean about them?
The left often likes to argue that poverty isn't a choice, that it's something that people just misfortunately happen to find themselves in. And while I'm sure this may be a case for certain people, in a lot of instances people do choose poverty. You see, a lot of cities across the country do actually have the policies that Adam Something advocates for. Many of these cities do offer services to the poor, such as homeless shelters, drug rehabilitation, and employment programs. Many homeless people simply choose not to use them because it would require effort on their part, and it's a lot easier to just sit on the sidewalk and shoot up heroin. You can offer homeless people the tools they need to improve their situation, but if they're not going to take the initiative to utilize those tools, then they're not going to get anywhere.
Right, so basically all social issues are channeled back onto the individual.
Well, yeah. I mean, what were you expecting? Some magical fairy is just gonna fly in, wave their wand, and make these social issues disappear? I mean, no problem ever gets solved without individuals putting forward the effort and the initiative to do something about it.
If you see a bunch of black folk in a ghetto, your first question will not be what system produced this inequality.
Well, I mean, that's one of among several questions I would ask. When tackling social issues, it can be useful to look for patterns in the data and see if there are any groups that are particularly affected by a problem. You can possibly glean some useful information from that, but just because there happens to be a correlation doesn't necessarily mean you have a causation, and factors other than racism could potentially be contributing to the discrepancy.
But rather, how come all these people are so lazy? And oh boy, does this result in some interesting follow-up questions. You know, how come all these black people seem to be unable to succeed in this meritocratic fair society created by white people? Is it a cultural problem, or more of a,
Hey Adam, can you do me a huge favor and not make that sound again? That was annoying as shit. It sounded like you were giving someone a blowjob while eating peanut butter.
biological problem?
Have you guys noticed that Adam seems really obsessed with this idea that only black people are poor? Like there are no successful or wealthy black people? Or that white people never experience poverty or struggles in life? It's coming across as if he's intentionally or not trying to equate being black and being poor, which, not gonna lie, is making me a little uncomfortable. Adam's basically arguing as if black people can't succeed unless they're sucking on the tits of government. Oh, but please, do tell us more about how we're the ones who are racist.
Hey, would you look at that? From one of the biggest foundational principles of libertarianism, we have organically arrived at white nationalist talking points.
You can't be both a white nationalist and a libertarian. To be a white nationalist, you have to believe that it's legitimate for the government to suppress the rights of certain people based on their race. And to be a libertarian, you have to believe that everybody's entitled to life, liberty, and property regardless of race. These two positions are mutually exclusive.
And this we call the libertarian alt-right pipeline.
So let me get this straight. Your argument is that believing that people are ultimately responsible for taking initiative to improve the world around them is somehow a slippery slope to becoming a skinhead white supremacist. And the evidence that you provide to support this argument is a bunch of shit that the government did that most libertarians are against.
And the main issue of this libertarian idea of personal responsibility is that it's just so fucking vague. What does personal responsibility mean? In what sense? In what context? In what philosophical framework? And the answer is whatever you feel like. I mean, it's so vague it can be anything. That's the beauty of it.
Mr. Strawman, give me a break.
Personal responsibility just means taking the initiative and putting in the effort to improve your circumstances and the world around you. It's really not that difficult of a concept to understand. I feel like Adam is taking his lack of ability to understand this very simple concept and trying to project that onto everyone else, make it seem as if people are using this term somehow deceptively to save himself the embarrassment. And look, Adam, here's something you can do. If you're unsure of what someone means to say when they use a particular word, you can ask them for clarification. You can ask them what they mean to say when they use that word. You'll come across as a lot more intellectually honest than if you do what you're doing now and just assuming that everyone who uses the word is acting in bad faith.
And this exact same thing happens to the other fundamental libertarian ideas, which are complete control over your person and your property.
Wait, how is complete control over your person or property vague or open to interpretation? It's a pretty simple concept. You own yourself, and Adam Something said in another video that he's against slavery, so this is something we can both pretty much take as a given. And, well, if you own yourself, don't you also by extension own the fruits of your time and labor? This is actually a pretty simple concept. I mean, sure, there might be some gray areas involved here and there. For example, how much property can you legitimately claim? Or how much do you have to modify a natural resource before you can claim it as your own? But just because there are certain areas that aren't necessarily black and white doesn't necessarily mean that the concept of property as a whole is just completely arbitrary and up to interpretation.
And so, Christopher Cantwell, a speaker at the Unite the Right rally at Charlottesville, also known as the Crying Nazi, a former libertarian by the way.
Oh hey, look at this. Someone on the far right just so happens to agree with libertarians on a certain issue, therefore they're practically the same thing. You could make a drinking game out of this shit.
Wrote the following in his blog following Charlottesville. People should be free to exercise complete control over their own person and property. If blacks are committing crimes or Jews are spreading communism, discriminating against them is the right of any property owner. The fact that he may or may not miss out on good blacks or Jews is a risk he takes, and the merit of his decisions will be proven out by the market. So once again, the ideas he takes as a basis are so vague that he can just effortlessly integrate his beliefs into them, and it all works out okay.
So let me get this straight. Because believing in personal autonomy and property rights logically entails things that you don't like, instead of actually trying to make a counter-argument against it, you just assume that people are using these terms in bad faith. And by the way, even if this were all true, that libertarians are just using vague-sounding words, because it's easy for us to twist the definition to fit our narrative, well, wouldn't that exact same criticism apply to a lot of the terms you're using? In this video, Adam Something is frequently using words like systemic and society and the system, which are words that are kind of vague enough that you can interpret them in ways that are useful for your narrative. At least an individual is an identifiable thing that you can point to and say this is an individual. What is a society? What is a system? What makes a systemic solution different from an individual solution? Because these are vague abstract concepts that can't be tied to anything objectively tangible, then it can mean basically whatever the fuck Adam Something wants it to mean.
And so, if you are a person with empathy and a good understanding of the world,
Gotta love the subtle poisoning the well going on here. If you're a person with empathy and a good understanding of the world, then you're someone who agrees with me. And of course, we all know what intended implication he's going for there. The people who disagree with him aren't empathetic and don't understand the world.
you realize that currently, in certain areas of life, especially in America, systemic change is needed to bring about more happiness and better outcomes. And that requires state social policies, anti-discrimination laws.
Anti-discrimination laws don't fix the problem of racism or bigotry, it just forces it underground. If a racist business owner who doesn't like Muslims, for example, is forced to serve Muslims against his will, well guess what? At the end of the day, he still hates Muslims. So even if Muslims do technically have to be served at his business, they're still probably not going to get the same quality service as everyone else there. So you didn't actually address the problem of racism and bigotry, you just kind of put a band-aid over it. Like, wouldn't you rather just let racist business owners be open about their racism, so that way people can identify businesses where they'll probably receive poor service and know to avoid them? That way bigoted business practices will be rightfully penalized by the free market.
Affirmative action even.
Wouldn't giving people an artificial leg up just because of their race set them up for failure? We actually see this happen at a lot of universities that do implement affirmative action policies. These universities will give students an artificial leg up because of their race, which means they end up getting qualified for degrees and programs that are way above their head. So they just end up failing, and the affirmative action policy didn't do them any good. Even if you do believe that systemic racism is a problem that needs to be addressed, it doesn't seem like giving people an artificial leg up is the answer.
Welfare programs.
Welfare programs have a very bad track record of actually reducing poverty. In fact, in a lot of cases, they actually do the opposite. They encourage dependency on the state and disincentivize people from lifting themselves out of poverty. And again, pretty much every big Democrat-controlled city in America, such as New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, has every single policy that Adam Something is calling for here. And yet again, these cities still struggle with poverty and income inequality. If these liberal big government programs are supposed to be the silver bullet to solving all of these problems, then why do they show such a poor track record?
Which will also go to a lot of non-white people due to their socioeconomic circumstances.
So again, he's engaging in the subtle racism there, once again trying to imply that only people of color ever struggle financially. But more importantly, he also seems to be trying to straw man people who disagree with welfare programs as a bunch of racists. As if the problem that we have with welfare programs is that money's going to benefit people of color, as opposed to, more legitimate criticisms against welfare programs, such as that they're funded through coercion, they're economically unsustainable, they encourage state dependency.
In today's America, white people seem to have most of the power.
Yeah, try telling that to all the people who got kicked off of social media or fired from their job because they didn't agree with whatever agenda is being pushed by Black Lives Matter. And to the extent that white people do disproportionately hold power, do you think that might possibly be because of certain government programs and policies, such as property taxes keeping blacks stuck in shitty schools, the minimum wage which disproportionately disemploys people of color? I'm failing to see how this is a free market or capitalism problem.
And if you tolerate the status quo, or who knows, maybe even support it...
I don't know a single libertarian anywhere who supports the status quo. I mean, if anything, what Adam Something here is advocating for, the mentality that government should magically solve all of our problems and we shouldn't be responsible for ourselves, is closer to the status quo than what we advocate for. I mean, how far is this guy's head up his ass that he's trying to lump together libertarians with people who think white people should hold all of the power? Like, hey, newsflash, dipshit, libertarians don't think anyone should hold power.
Then it is quite simply in your best interest to side with political forces that are all about maintaining the current status quo. And would you look at that, libertarianism does exactly that.
Wow! You're an idiot!
Wait, how does libertarianism preserve the status quo, like, at all? There's a ton of things that are considered the status quo that we're against. A lot of it the same stuff that you are. Right now the status quo is the government gets to help itself to half of your income, spend it on corporate bailouts that keep shitty companies in business. None of us are in favor of that. Aside from school choice and ending the war on drugs, I can't think of many libertarian positions that get much attention in mainstream political discourse. I mean, this guy's here rattling off talking points you hear from CNN and MSNBC all the time, but apparently we're the ones defending the status quo.
So this is libertarianism from a social perspective, acting as an ideological platform for all kinds of unsavory folks on the far right.
I got some bad news for you, buddy. Your position has a lot more in common with the far right than does ours. Regulations on the economy, government control of private businesses, high taxes and high spending on public infrastructure. These are all very common in Hitler's Germany, Mussolini's Italy, and Tojo's Japan.
But hey, you might interject, libertarianism is not just that. It also has a lot to say about economics. It wants to free the markets, it wants more freedom for everyone, freedom to do business, freedom to buy or sell whatever they want. It's all about achieving liberty, free of any government meddling. Hence the name, libertarianism. It all sounds nice, but here's the problem. Hierarchy is inherent in capitalism.
No, it's not. There's nothing inherently hierarchical about capitalism at all. Within capitalism, everyone's on an equal playing field. You have the same right to enter into voluntary agreements as everyone else. You have the same right to enjoy the fruits of your labor as does everyone else. Now, it's true to say that organizations and firms within capitalism are hierarchical, but a lot of times this will get conflated with capitalism itself being hierarchical.
Your boss can be an incompetent dipshit who just got parachuted into his position through his relatives or something, and still have all the power over you while you have no power over them. And they can decide about your livelihood with a stroke of a pen.
Can your boss force you to work for him? Yes, it's true that your boss might call the shots within the workplace, but he has no power to conscript you, and you're free to leave if another employer can offer you a better deal, which you admit to later in the video. So while the specific organization that your employer is in charge of might be a hierarchy, capitalism itself is not a hierarchy because your boss doesn't hold any direct power over you. You still have the final say over whether or not to work there, and your boss has no authority over you once you leave the workplace.
Capitalism is also coercive.
Really? It is? When's the last time a private company put a gun to your head and made you buy something from them or work for them? I'm gonna go out on a limb and say never. Oh, but that's exactly what the government does all the time. You gotta love how this guy's been advocating for coercion basically this entire video, and now all of a sudden coercion is a problem when it's coming from the evil, no good, greedy private sector.
What if your boss is a total, emotionally abusive dipshit who just makes employees' life a living hell? I've had those bosses before.
So have I. You know what I did? I quit working for that employer. I left that employer, taking my skills and talents with me, to then use to contribute to the productivity of one of their competitors. This is how better working conditions are encouraged by the free market.
It's not fun, and I ended up resigning in all situations, but only because I had plenty of options.
I feel like you just kind of shot your own argument in the foot there, buddy. By acknowledging that capitalism enables the freedom of choice to leave an employer where you're not getting a good deal to one where you are getting a good deal, you've inadvertently undermined the case you're trying to make for how oppressive capitalism is. Suppose that we lived under a government-controlled economy. Do you think you would have had the same freedom to leave your job if your boss was treating you like shit? Probably not.
But what if I didn't? I would be screwed. I would have had to show up to work, take all the abuse with a smile on my face, and then pray to God I don't get fired, because if I do, I'm sleeping under the bridge.
Even in this hypothetical scenario where there's only one employer available to you, which I highly doubt would be the case because an economy couldn't really sustain itself with only one employer, but for the sake of getting a point across, let's roll with it for a minute. There would still be nothing stopping you from starting your own business and being self-employed, or anything stopping those people from forming a union and negotiating for better working conditions. Even if you are the only employer in town, your business isn't going to be productive if your employees aren't doing shit. So all the employees there could still collectively bargain and say, we're not going to work unless you treat us better.
Right. So it seems to me that right-wing libertarianism is not really concerned with, liberty, and it's only used as a facade for the true agenda, which is the creation and maintaining of hierarchies.
So if that's the case, then why are libertarians opposed to the federal government, which is like the single biggest hierarchy on the planet?
And that we call right-wing conservatism, which happens to be a precursor to right-wing fascism. And a few years ago this would have been a rather outlandish statement. However, since then we had the Republican Party's hard shift towards the far right.
So yes, it's true that the Republican Party has been shifting further to the right as of recently, but I don't see what that has to do with libertarianism. Also, Democrats have been shifting more to the radical left as well. So is believing in libertarianism also a slippery slope to being a Democrat? Like, I don't get what point you're trying to make here, buddy.
4 years of Donald Trump.
Donald Trump isn't really a libertarian, though. Like, okay, yeah, he rolled back a lot of regulations, and the economy's definitely better off for it. And he did lower taxes for the wealthy, but a lot of middle and lower class people actually saw their taxes increase under Trump's administration. On top of that, Donald Trump supported a lot of very draconian gun control policies. He's in favor of border controls and police militarization. He was even on board with the COVID socialism, insisting that his name personally be on every single one of the handout checks. While he might be comparatively libertarian leaning compared to a lot of politicians on the left, he's far from what libertarians have in mind.
We had Charlottesville and the very fine people on both sides.
So I'll be the first to say that I am not particularly a huge fan of the ideologies being represented at the rally in Charlottesville. However, this is a free country with free speech. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. They have the same right to peacefully assemble and voice their opinion as does anyone else.
And then we had the attack on the Capitol, which was essentially a coup attempt by Trump supporters, and came about as a result of Donald Trump questioning the result of a legitimate democratic election.
Oh, don't act like your side doesn't do that shit too. I remember back in 2016 when Donald Trump got elected, you guys were making up these weird conspiracy theories about Russia and calling for the Electoral College to be abolished.
With most of the Republican Party's backing, by the way.
Oh, you mean like the BLM and Antifa riots? With most of the Democrat Party's backing? I'm not defending what happened on January 6th, but it is extremely hypocritical to only call out political violence on one side of the aisle. Also, did you miss the part where Donald Trump went on Twitter and told the rioters to back down? Did you miss all the times that Donald Trump supporters, as well as Donald Trump himself, condemned the actions of the January 6th rioters? Or did you just filter all of that out because you're not interested in approaching the issue in a way that's intellectually honest? I have a feeling it's probably the latter.
So that's why I'm so comfortable calling right-wing fascism a natural and logical continuation of right-wing conservatism, Because as conservatism transitions towards the far right, it becomes less and less distinguishable from right-wing fascism, the symptoms of which I believe are there for anyone to see. And that is why right-wing libertarians always turn out to be fascists.
So yes, it is true that the further right an ideology becomes, the less distinguishable it is from fascism, but somehow you're trying to tie all of this into libertarianism, and I don't see the connection. Your entire argument seems to be that because libertarianism has a few beliefs in common with the far right, believing in libertarianism is somehow a slippery slope to believing in fascism. As a matter of fact, that seems to be the only argument you make in the video. I could have probably saved all of us this 30-minute response and just condensed it down to that summarization. And to be absolutely honest with you, as I've mentioned numerous times in this video, your ideology actually has a lot more in common with fascism and the far right than does ours. So if the small overlap that libertarianism has with fascism makes libertarianism a slippery slope to fascism, well then what does that make your ideology?
Oh, and by the way, I do believe in the importance of personal responsibility. I think we should all be responsible for our actions. I think no one on the left is seriously saying that we shouldn't. Only that next to the very important personal responsibility, we should have systemic solutions for systemic problems.
Systemic change requires personal responsibility. There's a tendency for people on the left to speak of society and the system as if they're these vague, nebulous entities that operate completely autonomously from the people who live within them. You want to know what the system is? You want to know what society is? It's just people. People like you and me, that's it. Sitting around and waiting for society to solve all of your problems isn't going to happen because guess what? You are society. I am society. We all are society. So if you want society to improve, the impetus is on you to do something about it. It's on me, it's on all of us. When Adam Something Here calls for systemic solutions, what he's really calling for is the government to point guns at people to solve the problem for him while he sits on his ass and feels good about himself. There are plenty of problems in society that need to be tackled. Poverty, homelessness, discrimination, racism, bigotry, these are all genuine issues. But they're not going to be solved by sitting around and waiting for the government to do something. There's a famous quote from Gandhi, "Be the change you want to see in the world." It's easy to sit there on your ass and bitch about problems. But until you get off your ass, go out in your community and do something about it, then nothing's going to change. Adam Something, you can sit there behind your computer and bitch about the world. You can call everyone who disagrees with you a Nazi, racist, fascist, etc. But at the end of the day, hard work and determination is what actually gets shit done in this world. Until next time, this has been Philosophosa, making stupidity play dead. Everyone take care.